Good afternoon and welcome to another of our installments of PLC parties for ELAR teachers and ELL teachers, GT teachers, all of those of you that work with students to develop their literacy. I'm Kelly Harmon and I'm sorry I can't be there with you live today, but we've got some great conversations that you're going to be listening to, and we've got some plans for you to be able to interact with the ELAR district department as we move through this training today. And at the very end of the training, I will be giving you a link to a Google form so that we can collect your questions and use those questions as we move forward and we plan for our next sessions in December. So today, I really just want to focus in on picking up where we left off. We were formally talking about taking our essential TEKs, breaking them down into the learning targets for the unit. And today we're going to talk about collecting and using the evidence of the learning daily so that we can move students towards the mastery of those essential standards. And so formative assessment is our big topic for the day. So our learning target today, what we really want to strengthen in our expertise is creating those formative assessments that will provide evidence of learning of the daily learning target. So we're not necessarily talking about common formative assessments. We're talking about what happens on the day-to-day that provides us with lots of information about whether students are learning and if they're ready to move on. That formative assessment that really helps us to make decisions about next steps. And so leaving here today, I'm hoping to give you some ideas for ensuring that your formative activities that you're doing with the students, where you are collecting that data and the students are looking at that data to determine if they've learned, that it's aligned to the learning target. So we'll talk a lot about the mental process of the learning target and how we're aligning, and then creating a plan for monitoring and adjusting instruction so that we can go for the win. Now, we do have a tailgate theme going on for our party this time. And the reason I chose that tailgate theme is that I really want to create the metaphor, just like if we were planning for the win for the Friday night football game or the Tuesday and Friday night volleyball game, whatever we're playing, we really want to have a game plan. And so part of that game plan is designing those plays, pulling out our playbook to see, what plays should we use. And then as we run those plays, evaluating how effective they were. And that's what formative assessment is all about. It's that in the moment, looking at how effective, how much impact are we having using this particular activity to see if we are getting to where we want to go, to that daily learning target. Our success criteria, we are going to continue to use the PLC process. And we're going to be using the question today, how will we know if they've learned what they need to learn on a daily basis? And that's not just we as teachers, but how will the students know that they've learned? We'll talk about that. And then we will be talking about being very intentional, carefully choosing our activities, our assignments, our checks for understanding, so that we can collect evidence quickly and use that evidence to make decisions about what our students need next from us. And then using that formative to help us decide those next steps, whether that being an intervention or an extension. But that's the success criteria that we really want to follow today. Now you'll notice on your screen that there is a QR code. So get out your cameras, scan that QR code. I'll tell you where it's going though. It's going into a folder that I created for you with lots of examples. So you'll go into the middle school folder and find some resources there for you, including an example unit that we looked at last time, and including some new documents that I've added since last time. So be sure and access those examples for your PLC team so that you can pull them out when you need a worked example or a model to look at. All right, so how are we doing with this PLC process and using our PLC questions? Last time we talked about this question number 1, what do we expect students to learn? And really, when we're going from the unit planning down to the day-by-day planning, we're really saying with the learning targets, what do we expect them to learn today? So our target should tell us and them what they're going to learn, how their schema or their skills are going to change. So I'm just wondering, how is that going for you? Now, is it impacting your students the way you're hoping it will impact the students? I had an opportunity to sit down with a few of our specialists in the district and have a great conversation with them. And they have some share outs for you that they'd like to celebrate some of the work that you're doing. So here it is. The learning targets. Our last session was really how to unpack those learning targets and why that was so important. And we said there was 2 reasons. For teacher clarity was one reason. So we can be insanely clear on what we want students to learn. And the second reason was so students could self-evaluate, self-assess. How are we doing? Autumn, what are you seeing out there?
Well, I mean, I've definitely seen on all the campuses that I have visited, I've seen a shift. You're seeing learning targets, you're seeing strong attempts at success criteria. I will say there's a couple of shout outs that you could give. Literally, the 7th grade team at Lopez, they do a phenomenal job with the learning targets and success criteria, and they check back in with the students as they're teaching and kind of take a temperature of the class and see if they can keep proceeding or do they need to stop and clarify something. I can say the same for Brittany Chapman at Ed White. Like, hers are very specific. They're very clear and concise, and she checks in with the kids to see if they're there and if they can use that information now to proceed, or does she need to slow down? Does she need to reteach something? Does she need to provide some more practice? And so seeking that teacher clarity with the students and making sure that like what you've delivered is clear to the kids is the whole purpose of the learning targets and the success criteria. It's to inform like your next instructional decision. And that is what I'm seeing teachers attempting to do. Is it perfect? No. No one's success criteria or learning targets are going to be perfect. But they're being brave in the attempt, and that's the major step. And so I'm glad that we're seeing that because it is a hard shift to make.
All right, just a little bit of comment from Autumn. She's out there, she's working with you, and she's available to you, as is Heather. You see Heather Williams here and Karen Sharp. So we got to sit down and kind of talk through our next steps moving into formative assessment. But before I go on, I'd like to hear from you. So we'd like for you to use the chat feature right now. How are you doing with learning targets? What are some celebrations that you can have? Are the learning targets impacting the student learning? So we'll take just about a minute and pause the video and let you write in the chat, how is it going? So you've shared some ideas, some celebrations about how learning targets are going. Let's move to the next step. In the whole planning process, as we use the PLC process, we first ask ourselves, what do we expect students to learn? But the next question is, how will we know if they've learned it? And it's really a 2-part question. And so in this, when we ask how will they know what they learned it, if they've learned it, we need to have in mind some very specific activities or assignments that we're going to have the students do during the lesson that is going to give us some insight into their thinking and into their skill development. So that's what I want us to explore today in the process of writing my learning targets, my success criteria, my formative assessment, and writing really my lesson. In ELAR, I really like to go from the learning target to the activities and assignments, which are always going to be formative for me because I'm going to use whatever the students are doing to collect data, to collect evidence of the learning. And so I asked our specialist kind of to share with us some of their thinking about how we're doing that. How are we in being very intentional about collecting day-to-day evidence of the learning? And I referred them, and I'll refer you to the t-test. And there's 2 dimensions that really speak to this and the importance of planning this out. Dimension 1.2, of course, is how are we using formal and informal methods to measure student progress? And then how are we managing that in our brains with 100 and something students? How are we managing all that information we're getting and using that data to inform instruction? So they're going to be sharing with us some things that they've seen, that they've done, and suggestions they have about how to be intentional, to plan that. And then while we're in the moment, that dimension 2.5, the instruction dimension, how we use this data that we're collecting on the go, minute by minute monitoring happening, how we use this data to really adjust instruction and to decide if we need to differentiate, if we need to have a tier 1 intervention. So really looking at the distinguished criteria for the planning of how we're going to monitor and adjust instruction, but also in the moment, how we're using that. So they're going to share with you some of the benefits and how this is really helping us as teachers do less work. And then they're going to be giving us throughout the training today some suggestions of how to make this happen, so we can be distinguished on our t-test. Let's listen in. Heather's got some ideas for us here about the benefits.
Instead of worrying about the activities yet, like what are we going to do this week and that week, let's start from the beginning. Take the time during PLC, like you said, Autumn. Figure out what the formative assessments are going to be, and then come up with how are we going to get there then? And then everything else will fall in line afterwards, because then there's all the extra activities or ideas that you had before that seemed unorganized and didn't meet those learning targets, or there wasn't clear success criteria for that. Why are we doing this on this day? Now, if you know what's going to happen at the end, it cuts down the other planning, I think, a lot.
All right, so Heather's making some really great points there about if we'll think first about the learning targets and then about the formative assessment, how are we going to know they learned? It will save us so much time going and looking for activities or going through textbooks or trying to find, because we have a clear vision of exactly where we want to go. So it helps us to not get dragged under or go into Alice's rabbit hole there, where we might go into looking for things before we really know what we want students to learn that particular day. So as we move this forward here, so as we think about looking at a formative assessment, I did want to point out that in your IPGs, you have the stage 2 assessment information in every IPG for every one of your units. And this is really more of the after learning has taken place, measuring it, more of the not necessarily just summative. It is summative in nature, but summative and formative. Well, now do we need to provide tier 2 interventions? But I want to talk today more about what do you do before you ever get there, before you need to do the stage 2 assessments. How do we collect evidence daily? And so that's through formative assessments. And just to clarify, I added this page to your handout because I want us to all have the same definition, a shared definition of what is a formative assessment. It's not just watching and monitoring, but it's using that evidence of learning to make a decision about the next steps. And as we're planning out what we're going to have students do, we need to plan things that will help them reveal to us their misconceptions and misunderstandings. That if they're not understanding, we can take action quickly, and we can provide even a tier 1 intervention, which could be just a quick one-on-one meeting with a student or a group of students, or pairing students up to have a discussion, so that one student who may be slightly have more understanding would be explaining or giving an example to a student that might not quite be understanding or there yet in their progress. The formative assessment, though, allows us to monitor and check for understanding and adjust that understanding. So, it's going to be your quick checks. It's going to be things that you're going to do at the beginning of the lesson, just see if they have the prior knowledge that you want them to have. Most importantly, it's going to provide you with the evidence so that you can quickly give feedback to the student. So we don't wait to give that feedback. So we give that feedback that is designed to move from where the student is presently to close that gap, that daily gap, to where we need them to be by the end of the lesson. So I'm going to say that formative assessment is any data you intentionally collect to measure the learning progress. And that includes students' discussion. Even sometimes the looks on their faces can give you a lot of data that can help you to see when they're understanding. You know how this goes. It's a process. I'm going to be able to collect the data very intentionally by saying, this is the target and here's exactly what I need to know that they know and can do in order to determine if they've met that particular target. So I did want us to go and listen to Heather and Autumn give us some suggestions about how teachers in the district are currently planning to monitor the learning target and what that looks like. Let's take a listen.
Sometimes teachers don't give themselves credit for what they're actually doing. And that's also something in the planning process when they're thinking about this. And in their PLCs, and they're initially developing it, and then later, whenever they go back to it, they're not always crediting all of their formative assessments. Sometimes they don't think of like the big question that they're asking in the middle of a reading and how they're chunking out things as formative assessments. They're not thinking of their exit tickets as formative assessments. They're not thinking of their warm-ups or their quick writes as formative assessment. Sometimes they're just thinking of that as just a portion of their lesson, but they really are opportunities for checks and check-ins with students, and to have students elaborate and share what they're learning. And you are seeing a lot of that, and it's creating more feedback loops in classrooms, and that's going to increase the learning. And ultimately, that's what that success criteria is. So you're teaching kids, to check in with you and advocate for themselves regarding their own learning. And they can't do that if you're not creating the checks. And so you can put up the success criteria, but if the formative assessment isn't actually built in and being done, and the success criteria is just a list on the board, then there isn't anything for the kid to measure for themselves. And there's nothing for you to use to measure. It goes to say with like our independent reading practice with self-selected reading, the conferring that's going on in some campuses, and how teachers are revisiting prior knowledge that was built or prior learning, and taking a previous learning target and now making it, success criteria for what's going to be new learning. And kind of building in all those skills and building it into the conferring process. And so you're seeing.
All right, just a little clip there from great ideas. Autumn's absolutely right. Sometimes we're not taking enough credit or being, intentional enough. We're doing all of these things, but are we using this information? Are we being so intentional in our game plan of how we're going to get students over that goal line for the day? Are we being intentional enough to say, I need this piece of information so I'll know if we're ready to move to the next step in the learning process, the next step in the success criteria, if you will. So you already have lots of activities and assignments going on. It's just, how are we matching that up to the learning target and bridging that over to the success criteria? I believe we need the formative assessment plan for the lesson before we maybe can even write the success criteria. And that's why we're doing this particular session right now, is because as we make that plan, that game plan, it's going to help us later on to write the success criteria, or in the next step to write the success criteria. All right, so let's move to here. I just wanted to give you examples. These are just some of the ways that students show that they know. In the Learning Targets book by Moss and Brookhart, they talk about it as a performance of understanding. If you have a learning target, you need a performance of understanding. As Autumn was mentioning, there's a lot of opportunity for performances of understanding within a lesson. You may have students doing some pair shares. And that pair share, that check for understanding, is giving you time to monitor those partnerships, to move around the room and to hear what students are saying, so you can note misconceptions, misunderstandings, and you can refer them back to the success criteria. And you can check to see, are we moving towards the mastery of that learning target today? Another one that we talk about is creating a tableau, a freeze frame, and having students work in a group. And this is really good for students who need to get up and move, or your afternoon classes, or any time where they need to be up and moving, working with teams, talking things out, processing. They need to process the learning. It has to go in their ear and out their mouth. Dr. Marzano talks about processing as being conversations. We need them to be having those conversations so we can monitor, but they need to be having the conversations so they can process and make sense of the new learning. You may have a target question, small group conversations, Socratic seminars that you're having, or literature circles. And then, the things we typically talk about for assignments, like we want them to annotate, we want them to write constructed responses. So any kind of product you could collect that's going to provide evidence of hitting that learning target. But it doesn't have to be a quiz. We do plan quizzes, or we plan performance tasks at certain points so we can track the data. We can put that into Aware. But all along, we need to be just collecting data minute by minute to say, are we getting where we want to go today? Are we getting to our learning target destination today? And we got to plan out exactly how we want to do that. So as I was walking buildings a few years ago, it's just looking at and seeing these things going on in classes. This was a before they started to do the reading. The teacher had 3 different topics. They had a few minutes to think about their answer to the question by themselves. And then they were working in more of a circle kind, where they would raise their card if they had something that they wanted, something they wanted to say or add on to something that another student said. Now, this provided a great opportunity for the teacher to really monitor their thinking at this point, and to make sure that they were ready for the work that they were about to do. So this is a pre-assessment. They were really using this as a pre-assessment here. In the last session that we did take a look at some of the example where I wrote out an example of how I would plan out the learning targets first, and then I would go into the formative assessment pieces. And you'll notice that when I'm planning out my learning targets, I first of all am thinking about the level of thinking I want the kids to do. So the verb plus the action statement. So they're determining whether the controlling idea is adequately supported, which means they're analyzing, right? So if they're going to have to analyze to see if the author is adequately supporting the evidence, then they're probably going to have looked at 2 articles on the same topic. This is just my thinking, and they decide which one has the strongest evidence. These would be articles they've read before on the same topic to see. I really want them to make a judgment, to determine, to analyze that. And this is the activity they'll be doing. All right. Notice I write it in an I will statement, because it's the students are going to do this to show that they have learned the learning target. Now, I do have the success criteria over here, and we'll get more into that next time. But after I have the formative assessment, then I will go and write the success criteria, because it's really the thinking that we want kids to be able to do while they're doing the formative assessment that shows that they hit the learning target. So it's really critical that we look at the mental process, the verb and the action statement in the learning target, and make sure that our formative assessments are aligned. Often they're not. And so that's a critical misunderstanding or missed opportunity is this not aligning. The final activity needs to be aligned to the level of the mental process in the learning target. So that's something to look at. Now, before I ever get to this activity though, there's other things, there's other ways I'm going to be collecting evidence. So I wanted to share with you just some of those other ways. Mr. Vega shared this, and I think this is such a great example. I did do a little adaptation for middle school for this, but what he's done is he shared how they broke down the TEKS into the learning targets and then the formative assessments, the quick daily checks. So you can see that they're going to be using a text and using that text to explain how the supporting evidence develops the controlling idea. But before even that, they're going to be doing an activity called expository genre circle. And then they're going to be having small group discussion share outs with this use of study seat blast. And then they're going to be analyzing the author's evidence. All of this in one period. All of this in one period of time. So you know, it's moving fairly quickly. And then this is the thinking that the students will be doing along the way. This is what we're monitoring for. Can they identify the different types of evidence in the informational text? Can they distinguish between the supporting evidence, those ideas and reasonings as they do these activities? And can they explain how the evidence helps the author communicate their intended message? So really nicely written out. I love this example. I think it's a great example for us to look at. There's also a list in your folder of formative assessments, the everyday quick checks. So just some ways for you to think about maybe some different things to do. Get creative. The formative assessment planning is where you do get to be creative. The science is they need to learn this. But the art of teaching is that here's how they can show it. And there's more than one way that students can show that they've learned. They will need the success criteria so they know the thinking they need to do. But this is the fun part. This is where they remember what they did in your class based on the ways that you got them to show what they've learned. Now, I do want to point out that the IPG has many, many suggestions for formative assessments. For example, in this 8th grade for the standard 8.9A, they did suggest for some of these foundational targets over here, drawing conclusions about how the author's purpose is achieved through text structure. They do have some suggestions, and you may recognize these. These are from Lead Forward. And so these are suggestions of ways that students can show. Let's take a look at it. So if I took that target, I can draw conclusions about how the author's purpose is achieved through text structure. The connect the dots activity may be a great way. It's definitely drawing conclusions is analysis. It's where they're taking the parts and coming up with making a decision about how they're related. And that's exactly what this activity is asking them to do. Now, before I even write the success criteria though, I've looked at this activity and I also need to think about what text we're using. Yeah, so before I write success criteria, I like to have in mind what text we're going to use. And then that way, when I pull the activity that I'm going to have them do, I'm looking through the text right then to make sure that it's going to lend itself to doing this kind of thinking. Just FYI, the success criteria is kind of right there. How are these ideas the same? How are these ideas different? And then how does this these ideas help achieve the author's purpose? So we're pulling out text structures, probably pulling out paragraphs. So looking at different paragraphs and helping the students make a connection between the text structure that was used in the paragraph and the purpose that the author had for that, for the audience, what the author wanted the audience to get out of that. And of course, using the Lead Forward instructional playlist, I can go on there and get so many great ideas of things that I could have students do, but they're almost always going to need to be adapted to the text that we're using and sometimes to the mental process in the learning target, because it might not be the mental process. So I wouldn't use the compare contrast model, of course, if I said drawing conclusions, unless I was going to have them compare and contrast as a step into the process. And afterwards, after they finish the compare contrast, I'd say, now what conclusions can you draw? So it's a great resource, but there's usually a little bit of thought processes to go into it to make it work for the learning target that we have for the day. All right, now it's your turn. I have created a document where you're going to have an opportunity to get creative, to try out the process. There's at least 3 to 4 opportunities in every lesson to monitor whether they're getting to the learning target. So now you're going to get to write down some of your ideas. I've given you 2 targets. You can pick either one of them. And you're going to either work alone or work with your PLC team to determine how would you know that they've learned? Are they ready for it? So there should be some sort of pre-assessment activity that's maybe 5 minutes long max, given that we have short periods of time for instruction. But about 5 minutes before I launch into my learning target, I want to do some kind of pre-assessment activity to see if they have the prior knowledge that they need. And then as I'm working through the success criteria, which becomes my teaching points, if I need to demonstrate or model the thinking, I want to stop after every success criteria and do a check for understanding. So that means it's like a 1 minute, 2 minute back to the students, let it go in their ear and out their mouth, some kind of processing, maybe using whiteboards to share their thinking so we can monitor the class fast and to see, okay, are they ready for the next success criteria? Because we want to do these before we get to the task or the performance. So what are the students going to do? What is the task or performance that they'll do that will show that they have learned to determine the author's purpose for writing this informational article? And as I mentioned earlier, you're probably going to want to know what text we're using. So you maybe have some ideas for that. Now, these are targets right out of the Unit 2. So I'm hoping that you'll be practicing writing these and then can absolutely use them soon working with your own students. So I'm going to take you to the link. Here's the link for the work that we'll be doing. I've created just a slide deck. We have about 100 slides in here. They're all exactly the same. So you're just going to jump on a slide, any slide that no one else is working on, and quickly put your school and your name on it. So everybody will know somebody's on that slide. And they won't be working on your slide. And then here's where you'll be doing the work. You'll be writing in your thought processes for this particular target. Just remember, you've got to consider the mental process. They're determining the author's purpose. So what we're working up to making sure that aligns, that this task is having them determine the author's purpose. So this is the work you'll be practicing. Maybe take about 5-10 minutes to decide, to make some decisions. And we'll have about 100 different slides that you can look through to see if what things that you thought about having the students do are the same or different than what other people have thought about. Of course, you're going to have to take into consideration, are my students English language learners? Then my activities may be a little bit different. Are my students AP students or gifted students? Then I might have different activities. But we're going to guarantee that students will leave our Unit 2 knowing how to determine the author's purpose for writing informational articles at the complexity level of our grade level. So now's a great time for us to pause the video, spend a little time working on this. If we don't get it all finished today, it's fine. When we come back in December, we're going to come back to this and we're going to add the column of success criteria. So we will need this for December. All right, now that we have our formative assessments matched to our learning targets, aligned to them, it's really about the final question is, well, how do you and your students use the data, the information gathered? More importantly, how do the students use the data? That's the important information for me, because we want students to be self-evaluating and making their own game plan and communicating with you. We don't have time to be the gatekeeper of all the learning. We have too many students and we have lives. So we want our students to really be active participants. And that's how we know we're going to have the most impact on student learning, is when those students are using the learning targets and the evidence collected to determine if they've learned. So we have a few more ideas for you about what this might look like. I think Heather's going to share with us some ideas with working with her, some of our teachers who are working with English language learners, some of the things that they do.
They work with their students in reading groups. And so what Autumn was talking about, when they meet, in these small groups, they conference with their students. And that's one of the ways that they are moved on. They're tested out of that level. It's real flexible grouping, and they're tested out of that level, but there's a conversation between the student and the teacher at the beginning when they enter that level of reading about what are the goals for that particular level. They have a little card that they talk about, and then as they work through this level, they revisit their power goals in this and on this card. And I know it's called power goals, but it's the same thing as the learning targets and the success criteria, because there's that conversation, how between the student and the teacher, how am I going to meet this power goal? And then with that discussion, they figure out what they're going to do next in the group. So.
It sounds like this teacher and the student are negotiating the formative assessment or the summative assessment. It's like asking the students, how can you show that you've learned this goal, this learning target, which they can come up with ways to do that. Ask and they will give you ideas. We don't have to do all the work ourselves. All right, so that's super important for us to be conferring with students, asking them, how can you show that you've learned? Really partnering with our students. And we know that is what is going to move our students the furthest, the fastest. Now, how do we engage our students with self-assessment? They need to build awareness of their strengths and weaknesses. They need to track their own progress because there's too many of them and not enough of us. So just a few final ideas here. Have students regularly sit down and think about this unit. How are you doing in this unit? What are your strengths as a reader of informational text or a writer of informational text? What do you do really well? And what are some challenges for you? And these challenges become their own personal goals and can become differentiated learning targets for them. And then ask them what the game plan is. How do you think that you could strengthen these challenges that you're having? What do you need to do? What do you need me to do to help you get there? So really having them do a lot of self-evaluating and then giving you that information. This is a quick read for us to see where they think they are. And sometimes they are not exactly sure where they are. Kayla Allen, former Bradley teacher, used this tip, this 5-3-1 chart, and pasted these on the desk and was asking students at the beginning of class, in the middle of class, and at the end of the class to look at the learning target and to say where they are right now, and just putting a sticky note on their progress. And of course, this relates, okay, here's the learning target. And as they're going through the success criteria to get to that 5, they would have to say, I've got all the success criteria. I'm ready to do the task. I can show that I have met this target. Another way, and we talked about this last time, was giving the students the list of the learning targets for the unit or for the week, and then asking them to keep track as we move through the unit. And so they may be at the beginning of the unit, the beginning of the week saying, well, I don't even know what this means. I need lots of help. But over time, they're moving towards, I've got this. And so I'm hoping that some of you have already started doing that. And if you would put that information in the chat, also include that in the Google form at the end. Let me know if you are giving your students the targets ahead of time and then having students keep track of their mastery of the targets, and how is that impacting your students? We'd love to get some examples out there. Here's a really simple way. Did you meet the target today? What's the evidence? And so putting this on students. Did you meet it? Is it in progress or not yet? And met means I've got all the success criteria. I hit that target. How do you know? They're telling you the evidence. They're giving you the formative evidence. This is a great way to do an exit ticket. Our exit tickets are related to our learning targets. Do the kids think they got them? And this one's laminated so that kids can just write on them in dry erase marker. You can quickly collect them, as they're leaving, you're looking through them, you're sorting them into 3 piles, met, in progress, not yet. And it's just a quick way to gather that data and then be able to make decisions about the next time. So with that said, it is time for us to wrap up this session. Next time we'll meet on December 6th. And we will be talking about success criteria. We will need to bring our learning targets and our formative assessments, and we will help you write some of that success criteria next time. So I hope to see you back in December. I hope today that you're ready to go and create those formative assessments that are aligned to the success criteria. If you do need any help, I'm available for coaching, as is Autumn and also Heather. So don't hesitate to reach out if you need any kind of help at all. I put a QR code there. It'll take you right to the sign up sheet and you'll see what my availability is. I have some availability, in fact, next in 2 weeks on Monday morning. So if anybody needs that time, I'm here for you. Last thing I'll ask you to do today is go on to our Google form. And this is actually going to be your sign out for the session and your time to reflect. So again, grab your cameras on your phones, scan that QR code. We'll also put the link to this in the chat for you. And if you'll just take a few minutes and fill this out. This information is my formative assessment. So I'm going to be looking at what questions you still have, and that's going to really help me to plan the next session for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate all the hard work that the Northeast Middle School teachers are doing. And I just want you to know that it is very appreciated. Your students and parents appreciate it. We know how hard this year is. If you need anything at all, your ELAR department is phenomenal and they're here for you. So don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you and have a blessed day.